Hello everyone, I'm Mustagigafo, and today we're going to be continuing the Madness at the Darkmoon Faire card review. This time with Rogue, Shaman, Warlock, and Warrior. These are the last 4 classes, and the video after this one will be about all of the neutral cards. First we have Rogue. Now this class is kind of an odd one out in this expansion, because most of the cards in it go towards one archetype, and then there are other ones kind of scattered around that go to other miscellaneous ones from the past. But the one main archetype that Madness at the Darkmoon Faire is trying to push is Shuffle Rogue, which consists of Prize Plunderer, Foxy Fraud, Swindle, Tenwu of the Red Smoke, Ticket Master, Malevolent Strike, and Grand Empress Shekzara. So not all of these cards fit into the Shuffle archetype based on their text alone, but they all do fit in eventually because of utility and their overall quality. One being Prize Plunderer, a great single target removal card for the late game. Foxy Fraud is a excellent card that reduces the cost of combos, making huge tempo plays in the early game. Swindle is a great value engine that combos to draw a spell and a minion, which diversifies your draw and gives you a variety of options. Tenwu of the Red Smoke can return high value cards like Grand Empress Shekzara, make them cast their battle cry again. Then there's Ticket Master, which is the main catalyst for this Shuffle archetype, with text reminiscent to Faldore Strider from the past. Malevolent Strike directly synergizes with cards that didn't start in your deck, and is a great removal tool for that archetype. And Grand Empress Shekzara may not be needed in these archetypes, but is a great inclusion. Now, all of those cards amount to what I think is going to be a Cthulhu Shuffle Rogue. And I say Cthulhu because when you start the game, he breaks into 4 different cards, and the key thing is that they didn't start in your deck. So cards like Malevolent Strike will trigger off of those cards, and Stowaway perhaps can draw them. I think this is the archetype where Cthulhu makes the most sense, because it directly ties into the shuffle mechanic. But then there are a few outliers, those including Cloak of Shadows, Shadow Clone, and Sweet Tooth. These cards are of lesser quality. I think Shadow Clone will be the best one out of the 3, but that entirely depends on the Secret Rogue actually coming back, and with this pool of cards, I don't know if it will. Then there's Sweet Tooth. The thing is, it has to be corrupted, and stealth decks want to be fast, and Sweet Tooth is not fast. And there are other 4-mana cards that do its job better. Burrowing Scorpid is just a better version of it. And then lastly is Cloak of Shadows, which I would keep an eye on for future expansions, but it has no relevance now when Cthulhu Shuffle Rogue is the dominant archetype. This doesn't really fit in. I mean, sure, you get to avoid damage for a turn, but Shuffle Rogue doesn't need that, I think. So all in all, Cthulhu Shuffle Rogue will be the dominant rogue archetype. There might be some hyper aggro rogue out there, but I think Cthulhu Shuffle Rogue will be the most dominant and common of those rogue archetypes. Next up we have Shaman. I think this is the most disappointing class, just because it kind of introduces a new synergy that I don't think will work. I came up with one definitive archetype for Shaman, and that archetype is Attack Shaman. And the cards included in that are Cage Match Custodian, Deathmatch Pavilion, Pitmaster Stormstrike, Whack-a-Null Hammer, and Inara Stormcrash. Out of these cards, I think Cage Match Custodian is the highlight, just because it can be put into more decks than just this narrow application of an Attack Shaman. It can be used in Evolve Shamans to get your Bogspine Knuckles, and it can be used in Totem Shaman to get a Splitting Axe. And it can be used in Attack Shaman to get pretty much any weapon it runs. So this is a card that steps in front of the rest. Next is Deathmatch Pavilion. It's one of the many lackluster support cards for the attack shaman. I'm not sure how early this can be played. There are no 1-mana weapons for shaman, so the earliest you're getting this out is on turn 4, which is kinda slow for 2 3/2s. And then we have Pitmaster. It kinda suffers from the same problems as Deathmatch Pavilion. Even though it doesn't directly synergize with attacks, I think it'll still be put into that realm of the aggro shaman. It summons duelists just like the Deathmatch Pavilion does. Maybe a corrupt shaman deck becomes a thing, and if it does, this is going to be in it. But initially, it's not great, and corrupted, it's not great for the rate that it's going at either. So another disappointing duelist summoning card. Then we have Stormstrike, which does provide more utility than the other cards, but I still think will be left in the dust because the attack shaman archetype probably isn't going to work, and the card isn't great in any other deck. Next we have Whack-A-Null Hammer, which is, I think, one of the better cards in Shaman right now, at least for the attack synergy ones. I think it could go into any aggro shaman that's missing its last 2 cards. That spot is kind of narrowly edged out by other cards that synergize with decks more than this could. And then lastly is Inara Stormcrash, which I just think is going to fall with the rest of the attack synergy cards and just kind of be lumped in with the mediocrity of them. And then there are a bunch of cards that support a bunch of different archetypes, and those are Revolve, Grand Totem Eyesore, Magic Fin, and Dunk Tank. Now Revolve goes into Evolve Shaman, Grand Totem goes into Totem Shaman, Magic Fin might go into Murloc Shaman if that magically comes back from the dead, and Dunk Tank goes into the aforementioned Corrupt Shaman. So all in all, Shaman's looking kinda mediocre this time around. The main archetype that's being pushed isn't that great, and is overshadowed by other aggro decks. And the other cards not in that archetype are a bit fringe to be considered viable for their archetypes, except for Dunk Tank. I think that's the main exception for the Shaman. That is a very good card for corrupt control style decks. And here we have Warlock. I was able to come up with 2 archetypes for it, and the first one is Demon Zoo, which includes Midway Maniac, Free Admission, Manari Mosher, Fire Breather, and Ring Matron. Let's start with Midway Maniac as just a very well statted minion with Taunt. This synergizes very well with Manari Mosher. After that we have Free Admission, which is a great draw spell for especially pure demon zoo archetypes. And then there's Manari Mosher, which is an all-round great synergy card. Getting lifesteal in a zoo deck is very unique, and it should give the zoo deck a lot more survivability. And then there's Fire Breather, which is just a great one-sided board clear. There's not much to say about this one. And Ring Matron, which is a great top end of the curve kind of card, especially if it's cost reduced by Free Admission. This is a great powerhouse that sticks on the board and has a big impact. And then there's a second archetype, which is kind of a corrupt control mill deck, which includes Cascading Disaster and Ticketus. Cascading Disaster is an easy inclusion into pretty much any control Warlock because of its efficiency, and corrupting a 4-cost card in a control deck shouldn't be too hard. A lot of the time you're going to be destroying 3 random enemy minions with a 4-mana card, which is great value. And then there's Ticketus, which this one really took me by surprise, because at first I thought it was gonna go into the Demon Zoo, but then I looked closer, and I thought, pretty much as long as it was revealed, I've been thinking about this card in particular, and then came up with the control mill archetype, which I think is going to be pretty nice because of a lot of different mill cards like this and a bunch of neutral ones. Corrupting this is going to be pretty hard, but I think it's acceptable just to play this as a 6 mana 8/8, and it removes the top 5 cards of your deck. I think that's an acceptable outcome if you're in a pinch, but you really want to hold out until you corrupt it. And apparently, Ticketus is very highly rated by the community. I don't know if I have that much hype over this card, but I definitely do see where it's coming from. And then lastly, we have a couple outliers, those being Wicked Whispers and Revenant Rascal. I think Wicked Whispers could be included in the Demon Zoo deck, but I think it's kinda bad, and maybe even worse than Grim Rally that came before it. Because with Grim Rally you could trigger death rattles and such, while with this card, you discard the lowest card, which is not great. The only low-cost discard synergy card right now is Boneweb Egg, and that costs 2 mana. Getting Boneweb Egg with this is pretty good, but that high roll is only going to happen so many times. And I don't think discarding a card without any payoff is worth giving your minions +1/+1. So I think this card just barely falls short of making the cut in the Demon Zoo deck. And then there's Revenant Rascal. I have been going back and forth on this one for a long time, and it was revealed early, so I had a long time to think about it. I think this one also doesn't make the cut just because it's not a demon for whatever reason. I don't know why it's not a demon. I don't know why they didn't make it a demon. It looks just like a demon, but it's not a demon. So free admission whiffs if you draw this off of it. So I think that alone makes it miss the cut because free admission is just such a good card. But on another hand, its effect is kind of meh. It would be one thing if it destroyed a mana crystal for your opponent only. That would be a great card and would probably even circumvent the free admission hurdle. But it's symmetrical, and while Zoo doesn't really care about having mana at high mana pools, on curve this card is devastating for a Zoo archetype. So I think that's why it misses the cut. And then there's Deck of Chaos. I didn't even mention it because it's just such a weird out there card, and it's so sad that I think it's not going to see play, pretty much just due to its high cost. I mean, sure, it's Luna's Pocket Galaxy Light, but how good is Luna's Pocket Galaxy in Warlock, especially when it doesn't reduce the cost to 1? Like, what are you going to use this card in? Like, Malagos? It takes so long to draw this card that you might just end up drawing Malagos before you draw it, and it takes 6 turns to be able to play it, and then on turn 6 you do nothing. It's just so anti-tempo, so you don't run it in a Zoo deck, obviously. Control cards usually are stat efficient, so especially in Warlock, most of the cards are stat efficient. Out of all the cards in this expansion, the only one that would be getting any benefit from Deck of Chaos in Warlock is Midway Maniac, and that's not even that much of a benefit. It's a 1 mana 2/5 instead of a 2 mana 1/5, which is a marginal difference when you're talking playing it in the late game. It's just so lackluster, and I have no idea if this could be used in any way practically. But with that little rant out of the way, all in all, Warlock's Demon package looks stronger than ever. Demon Zoo is definitely becoming a thing. Control Warlock is also going to be around. Last but not least is Warrior, and this time around they got a couple archetypes. One of them is obviously better than the others, but let's start with the worst one, which is Rush Warrior, and that includes Stage Dive, Bumper Car, and ETC God of Metal. I think Stage Dive surpasses the other two cards in their narrow application and is actually viable in other archetypes because its effect is pretty decent, and you're usually not playing this on turn 1 anyway, so corrupting it is fairly easy and not that big of a deal. Bumper Car is a very underwhelming card. It's 1 damage rush is disappointing, and its death rattle probably doesn't even trigger until your opponent's turn. And even then, they don't have to trade into it. It's a very low threat card, but I think its true utility comes in when it's paired with the third card, ETC God of Metal, which is a purely rush-focused card, provides no other utility other than face damage. This archetype is going to be so hard to pull off. Like, getting all of the right pieces at the right time is going to be so hard for Warrior that I think this package will see absolutely no play. It'll see experimentation, but after the initial wave of people trying stuff out is over, ETC God of Metal will become ETC God of Dust. Its effect is only good when you have like 5 rush minions in your hand, and that never happens. That never happens ever. Like, you're never gonna get this card to pull out a lethal. It's so impossible. It's ridiculous. And then, transitioning from that, we have the Control / N'Zoth cards. And I say /N'Zoth or /Control because most of these can go into just a purely control deck without N'Zoth synergy. That being said, the cards are Minefield, Ringmaster's Baton, Sword Eater, Ringmaster Watley, and Tent Trasher. Now, I'm just going to cover Tent Trasher first, because it can kind of go into the Rush deck, and even then, you might not include this one, just because it's a pretty weak body, and N'Zoth wants to resurrect something stronger and bigger. And then let's skip over to Minefield, which is a great control card for Warrior. That was just all around great. It's pretty much Dynamatics effect from Boomsday, but it doesn't cost 5 mana. And it can hit your opponent's mechs. So this is a great control card. Then there's Ringmaster's Baton, which only synergizes with the N'Zoth deck. And it's a hand buff weapon, which we haven't seen in a long time. This one I think can be successful if and only if N'Zoth Warrior's successful. But if it is, I think this card is going to be great in that deck, because eventually giving your minions in your hand +3/+3 is not insignificant. It will change the tide of some games. The weapon the effect is attached to has very low stats for a 2-cost weapon. Its effect more than makes up for it. And then there's Sword Eater, which is just a great card. It has a good body with a good effect, and generally going to be used in a lot of different warrior decks. And then there's Ringmaster Watley, which is a great draw engine for especially N'Zoth decks, but can also be worked around to be put into other control warrior decks. And then there are 2 cards that don't make it into either of these archetypes, which are Stagehand and Feat of Strength. These 2 are both pretty mediocre, Stagehand being a base stat minion with a very minor effect, and Feat of Strength being pretty much a 3-mana do-nothing card that affects taunt minions, and I don't think that's going to be significant in this meta, purely because taunt synergy has kind of died off ages ago. So this card, while maybe being good, just isn't going to see any play because of other better warrior decks that can't include it. All in all, the only warrior archetypes you're going to see are control archetypes, whether that be just a general control warrior or control N'Zoth warrior. With that said, the rush archetype is not going to work. The only good card to come out of that is Stage Dive. The other 2 hand buff cards are kind of odd inclusions into this expansion. I don't think they're going to see any play at all. And that is going to wrap up the 3rd installment of Darkmoon Faire card reviews. If you like what you see, consider subscribing. It helps out the channel more than you would think, and gets more people into this fine community we've made. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.